There is a specific kind of scar that tells a story without words. In the dimly lit corners of Liverpool's older public houses, if you know where to look, you might still catch a glimpse of them, perfectly triangular burn marks etched permanently into human skin. They are the physical receipts of a transaction gone wrong, a reminder of a debt paid in suffering, rather than currency. To the criminal fraternity who operated in the shadows of Merseyside, those marks meant one thing: you had crossed George Bromely. In the volatile landscape of the 1990s, Bromley was not your typical underworld figure. He did not traffic illicit substances or manage security at nightclub doors. Instead, he occupied a far more dangerous niche. He was the predator who hunted other predators. He did not sell the product, he taxed the people who did. His business model was brutal efficiency. Kidnap a supplier, seize their inventory, and apply absolute terror until they surrendered everything they had. His tool of choice was legendary, relying not on complex weaponry, but on a simple £15 household appliance bought from a high street catalogue. Most of his targets broke and confessed their secrets before the metal plate even touched their skin. Those who resisted ended up bearing the brand of the iron for the rest of their lives. By 1997, this ruthless strategy had made Bromley wealthy, but it had also made him the most despised man in the city. He had accumulated a fortune, but he had also accumulated a list of enemies that spanned the entire criminal spectrum. The local constabulary eventually issued him an official warning, stating that credible intelligence suggested a significant contract had been placed on his life. The rumoured price for his permanent removal was £100,000. Bromley, confident in his own terrifying reputation, and perhaps believing himself to be untouchable, largely dismissed the threat as posturing. But reputation is a fragile shield against a professional. On the evening of November 18th, the man who had instilled fear across an entire city walked into the kitchen of a trusted associate, feeling secure in what he believed was a safe environment. He did something he had not done in months. He removed his protective ballistic vest. He sat down at the kitchen island, picked up a newspaper, and began to drink a cup of tea. It was a moment of rare, unguarded normalcy. 30 seconds later, his era was over. A figure emerged from the hallway. A weapon fitted with a silencer was raised, and 3 rapid discharges shattered the quiet evening. There was no struggle, no exchange of words, and no opportunity for Bromley to bargain. The perpetrator secured the outcome they were paid for and vanished into the night, leaving behind no forensic trace and no witnesses willing to speak. Some tragedies are simply never meant to be resolved. The individual responsible for ending Bromley's life collected their fee and evaporated, leaving a cold case that has baffled investigators for nearly 3 decades. But to truly comprehend why this specific event sent shockwaves through the UK underworld, you have to look beyond the evidence on that kitchen floor. You have to understand the specific breed of chaos that allowed a figure like Bromley to exist in the first place. This is not just a story about a man losing his life. It is an examination of a city at war with itself, and how the untouchable finally met his match. To fully grasp the rise and fall of George Bromely, one must first navigate the labyrinth of the city that forged him. Liverpool, in the mid-1990s, was not merely a metropolis. It was a battleground undergoing a seismic cultural shift. The famed rave economy had crashed onto the banks of the Mersey, flooding the streets with cash generated by the insatiable demand for ecstasy. Iconic venues like Cream, the 051, and the Grafton were drawing thousands of patrons every weekend. Inside those walls, the music was loud and the energy was high. But beneath the surface, every transaction represented a fortune being amassed by those controlling the supply. Simultaneously, a darker epidemic was sweeping through the residential estates. Areas like Netherley, Norris Green and Croxteth communities, already straining under the weight of economic hardship and industrial decline, were being hollowed out by the prevalence of heroin. Into this volatile mix walked a new breed of criminal, a generation that held no reverence for the traditions of the past. For decades, the Liverpool underworld had operated under a strict, unwritten code. The old guard, men who had built their reputations on bank robberies and safe-cracking in the previous decades, enforced these rules with iron discipline. Disputes were settled privately, usually with fists. Families were strictly off-limits. If you had a problem, you kept it between the parties involved. But by 1996, those traditional gatekeepers were largely gone, either serving long sentences or retired to the sunny coasts of Spain. Their departure created a dangerous vacuum. The young men stepping up to fill the void were indifferent to codes of honor. The nightclub scene became the new front line. Security firms evolved beyond simply checking identification at the door. They began controlling the distribution networks inside the venues. Controlling a door at a major club became a six-figure enterprise. If you wanted to operate in that space, you paid a levy. If you refused, the consequences were severe. If you fought back, lives were lost. The escalation was rapid and terrifying. Firearm incidents, once a rarity reserved for specific, high-stakes jobs, became alarmingly commonplace. Weapons like Glocks and sawn-off shotguns flooded the streets. Carried by individuals far younger and more reckless than their predecessors, the boundaries of acceptable conduct dissolved. Women were targeted, families were threatened, and bystanders were caught in the crossfire of drive-by attacks aimed at rivals. The chaotic new world had no rules, and it was this precise environment that George Bromley fed upon. Bromley recognized a unique opportunity in the disorder. He was not interested in the logistics of drug trafficking or the headache of managing supply chains. He positioned himself as a predator who hunted the dealers. His business model was terrifyingly simple. Identify someone generating significant illicit profit, abduct them, seize their assets, and instill such profound fear that they would never dare seek retribution. It was known as taxing. In a city where law enforcement was stretched to the breaking point and the judicial system was overwhelmed, taxing became a growth industry. Bromley was not the sole operator in this field, but he was undeniably the most effective. While others relied on blunt force, Bromley understood that the threat of pain was often more lucrative than the pain itself, provided you had the right tool to deliver the message. What truly separated George Bromley from every other enforcer operating in Liverpool was his understanding of psychology. Other crews relied on immediate, chaotic violence instruments like bats or blades that inflicted damage quickly. While effective, these methods were often messy and over too soon. Bromley's approach was different. He understood that the anticipation of pain is often far more debilitating than the injury itself. He did not just want to hurt his targets. He wanted to dismantle them. And to do that, he utilized a device that was cheap, portable, and utterly terrifying: the steam iron. The routine was practiced and methodical. His team would intercept a target, usually outside a public venue, or shortly after a lucrative exchange. The victim would be transported to a secure location, stripped of their defenses, and bound to a chair. Then, Bromley would enter the room carrying the appliance. He would plug it into the nearest socket, set the dial to its maximum temperature, and simply wait. This period of silence was the most critical part of the process. As the metal plate began to heat up, Bromley would ask his questions in a calm, almost polite tone. Where is the rest of the inventory? Who else is involved? Where is the currency stored? Many individuals, realizing the gravity of their situation, would offer information immediately. But Bromley was a man who rarely trusted the first answer. He would let the device continue to heat, the silence in the room growing heavier with every passing second. Just when the indicator light signaled maximum intensity, he would perform a simple, calculated action. He would drip a small amount of water onto the plate. The resulting hiss, that sharp, aggressive sound of steam erupting, was often the sound that broke people. It was the auditory confirmation that the threat was real. If the answers provided were still deemed insufficient, the distance between the metal and the skin would close. The application was systematic: chest, abdomen, thighs. Accounts from those who survived these sessions described the sensory overload as overwhelming. It was not just the searing heat. It was the smell, a nauseating mix of scorched fabric and organic matter that filled the room. Some victims lost consciousness. Others lost control of their bodily functions. But invariably, everyone talked. Bromley's method could extract every detail, every hidden location, and every name in the supply chain. Once the information was secured, the financial demands followed. A call would be made to the victim's associates: deliver a specific sum to a specific location within 2 hours, or we return. The ransom was almost always paid. The alternative was not just further suffering, but living with the permanent consequences. The triangular scars left by the iron became a dark badge of recognition in the underworld. They were a permanent brand that signaled to everyone: I was broken. I gave up everything. In a world where reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, those marks were a professional death sentence. Bromley had turned interrogation into an art form, and fear was his masterpiece. By the mid-1990s, George Bromely was operating with a sense of invincibility that bordered on delusion. He had not only survived the inherent dangers of his trade, but seemed to thrive on them. However, between 1990 and 1997, a series of incidents occurred that would transform him from a feared enforcer into a liability that the underworld could no longer tolerate. It was a masterclass in how to guarantee that a contract is eventually placed on one's life. The first major warning sign came in November 1990 at the Brewers Arms. Bromley and an associate were confronted by Jimmy Callahan, a figure with whom they shared a volatile history. The confrontation escalated instantly when Callahan produced a firearm and discharged it, striking both men. In a bizarre twist that stunned local observers, Bromley initially broke the cardinal rule of the streets. He cooperated with the authorities, statements were given, and Callahan was detained. Yet weeks before the trial, the memory of the victims suddenly failed. The case collapsed, and Callahan walked free. But Bromley had not forgiven. He was simply waiting. Months later, outside a club on London Road, Bromley exacted his revenge. Emerging from the shadows, he launched a sustained and frenzied assault with a blade. By the time bystanders intervened, Callahan had sustained catastrophic injuries that would leave him confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. Bromley faced no charges due to a lack of willing witnesses, reinforcing the message that crossing him resulted in permanent devastation. He walked away from courtrooms again in 1995 after being accused of shooting a doorman, successfully claiming self-defense. He was becoming untouchable, but his actions were becoming increasingly erratic. Then came the incident that shattered what remained of the city's moral code. During a raid on a rival doorman's home, Bromley and his crew did not just target the man. They turned their aggression toward the man's partner, an expectant mother. In a world where families and women were historically considered off-limits, attacking a pregnant woman was viewed as an act of depravity that could not be overlooked. Even hardened criminals were appalled. This was not business, it was uncontrolled chaos. It signaled that Bromley recognized no boundaries, and that made him an existential threat to everyone. By 1997, the inevitable backlash arrived in the form of an official Osman warning from the Merseyside police. This was not a rumor. It was a formal notice stating that officers had intelligence of a verifiable plan to end his life. The contract was valued at £100,000, a staggering sum that was openly discussed in pubs and clubs across the region. When detectives presented this information to Bromley, he laughed it off, feigning arrogance. But privately, the paranoia had set in. He began wearing a Kevlar protective vest as a daily necessity, concealing it beneath his clothing wherever he went. He carried a loaded sidearm and a backup weapon at all times. His movements became erratic to avoid establishing a pattern, and he formulated an exit strategy, liquidating his assets to move his wife and young sons to the Algarve region of Portugal. He planned to vanish into the sunshine before the contract could be fulfilled. But in the underworld, contracts do not expire simply because the target relocates. Bromley was running out of time, and despite his precautions, he was about to make the one mistake that no amount of body armor could correct. The evening of November 18, 1997, was indistinguishable from any other damp Tuesday in Liverpool. Darkness had descended by late afternoon, and a cold winter chill was gripping the city. George Bromely, a man who had spent the last several months living in a state of hypervigilance, arrived at a detached property on Viner Court Road in West Derby. This was the home of Charlie Seeger, a 57-year-old former associate who had transitioned from the criminal life into legitimate business. The residence was a symbol of making it out, with its open-plan kitchen and heated swimming pool. It represented the quiet retirement Bromley himself was desperately trying to secure for his family. The two men had a long history, and Bromley trusted Seeger implicitly. They had been in deep discussions about a property transaction. Bromley was planning to purchase this very house. When Seeger eventually moved abroad, it was this familiarity, this sense of sanctuary, that led the most cautious man in Liverpool to make a fatal error. Upon entering the warmth of the kitchen, Bromley did something he had not done. Since the contract on his life was announced, he removed his body armor. He placed the heavy Kevlar vest aside, sat down at the kitchen island, and prepared a cup of tea. In a twist of grim irony, He picked up a copy of the Liverpool Daily Post and began reading a follow-up report on the Stephen Cole case. Another notorious local tragedy involving a machete attack. He reportedly muttered a comment to Seeger about how fortunate the survivors of that incident had been. He was relaxed, unarmed, and completely exposed. Then, the doorbell rang. The sequence of events that followed took less than 30 seconds. Seeger moved to the hallway to answer the door. Standing on the threshold was a figure clad in dark clothing, their features partially obscured. Before a word could be exchanged, the visitor pushed past the homeowner and strode purposefully toward the kitchen. Bromley, hearing the commotion, stood up from the island. In that fraction of a second, the realization must have hit him. There was no time to run, no weapon within reach, and no armor to absorb the impact. The intruder stepped into the doorway and raised a handgun fitted with a silencer. 3 rapid discharges followed. The marksman was professional and precise. All 3 projectiles struck Bromley in the head at point-blank range. The first impact incapacitated him instantly. The subsequent 2 were insurance, a guarantee that there would be no recovery. George Bromely collapsed onto the kitchen tiles, without uttering a gurr's sound. The assailant turned, walked calmly back down the hallway and disappeared into the November darkness. When emergency services arrived minutes later, they found a pristine crime scene. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no forensic trail. There was only the lifeless body of Liverpool's most feared enforcer, 3 shell casings, and a homeowner standing in his hallway, claiming to be just as shocked as everyone else. The untouchable man had been erased in half a minute, and the silence that followed was deafening. Within hours of the tragedy at Viner Court Road, the investigative spotlight turned fiercely onto Charlie Seeger. On paper, the suspicion was logical. The incident had occurred within his sanctuary, he was the sole witness, and he had emerged completely physically unharmed. As detectives delved deeper, they uncovered friction beneath the friendship. The property negotiation had stalled. Rumors suggested Bromley was attempting to force a sale at a price well below market value, leveraging his intimidating reputation to secure the deal. To the authorities, this looked like a classic motive, a man pushed into a corner who decided to strike first. In December 1997, less than a month after the event, Seeger was taken into custody and charged with the capital crime. The prosecution's theory was that he had lured Bromley to the residence and coordinated the arrival of the gunman. The trial that followed at Liverpool Crown Court was a tense affair. The defense argued a simple, terrifying reality. Seeger was merely an unlucky bystander who had opened his door to a stranger and watched a catastrophe unfold. With no forensic evidence linking him to the weapon or the shooter, and no proof of a conspiracy, the jury was left with reasonable doubt. In June 1998, Charlie Seeger was acquitted and walked free, leaving the official investigation at a permanent dead end. Yet, in the quiet corners of the city, 3 distinct theories continue to circulate, filling the void left by the lack of a legal verdict. The first theory aligns with the prosecution's original stance, that it was an orchestrated trap. Proponents of this view point to the body armor. Bromley was a man consumed by paranoia, yet he felt secure enough in that specific kitchen to remove his only protection. That level of comfort, they argue, implies a deep, misplaced trust in his host. The second theory suggests a purely professional intervention, independent of Seeger. The £100,000 contract was real and widely known. In this version of events, the timing was simply a collision of fate. A professional tracker could have followed Bromley to the location, waiting for the opportune moment when the target was stationary. Seeger, in this narrative, was exactly what he claimed to be, a man in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The third, and perhaps most unsettling theory, whispers of a deeper betrayal. It suggests that the information regarding Bromley's location came from within his own inner circle. Someone knew his schedule, knew his destination, and sold that intelligence to the highest bidder. In a city where loyalty had a price tag, this remains a haunting possibility. Regardless of who pulled the trigger, the removal of George Bromely fundamentally recalibrated the underworld. His passing shattered the illusion of invincibility. It proved that reputation alone was no longer a sufficient shield. The era of the freelance enforcer, the lone wolf who could dominate entire gangs through fear, died on that kitchen floor. The criminal landscape shifted towards organized firms and collective security. Running solo was now seen as a death wish. Today, nearly 3 decades later, the case remains technically open, but effectively frozen in time. The silence that descended on Liverpool in 1997 has never truly lifted. Those who know the truth, the identity of the gunman, the financier of the contract, and the logistics of the hit have kept their secrets. It serves as a stark reminder of the ultimate rule that replaced the old codes. Fear works, but silence ensures survival. The man who broke so many others was eventually broken himself, not by a rival of equal stature, but by the cold, transactional nature of the world he helped create.